So let me make it really dark so you'll get quiet. All right, thanks. So let's look at the schedule together so we know the lay of the land. We're only 2 weeks out, believe it or not, from test number 4. So, first of all, everybody listen up. I'm not going to talk over people. So, first of all, test number 4 is not a cumulative final. It's just on part 4 of the course, but it does function as our final exam. So after you take test number 4, 2 weeks from today and here, don't come back here again for Psych 101 because we're done, okay, at that point. That will be the final thing that we do together. Between now and then, here's the plan. Today we do part 2 of Psych Disorders. Thursday online we do part 3 of Psych Disorders. Your job between Thursday, ideally between Thursday and next Tuesday, is then to go in and watch the 2 recordings here that I've loaded into Blackboard for you guys. So it's in this announcement. It was also sent to you via email. These links have changed. It's the same recording. The links now are closed captioned, which is good for everybody all around. If you click on this one, it's the treatment part 1 lecture. You watch the entire thing. For treatment part 2, you only have to watch up until the 24-minute mark. You don't need to watch the entire second one. If you do, it's just the beginning of social psych, which is what we're going to do in here face-to-face next week anyway. Okay? Then when we do social psychology next week on Tuesday, that will be part 1. We will finish up social psych on Thursday the 28th online, and then again with the final tests coming on Tuesday the 3rd. Your last learning curve activities will be due on that Monday night before test number 4. So if I just show you that so everybody knows when those are due, over here in Launchpad, if you click on the, not the grade book, the calendar, you'll see that what we've got coming up for these learning curve quizzes is right there. So we've got the Psych Disorders chapter 13 due this coming Sunday night at 11, and then these due at Monday night at 11, the day before test number 4. I've had a couple people the last couple times that learning curves have been due saying, oh, it said it was due at 8, I thought it was due at 11. They're all due at 11. Trust me, if I click on each of these, you'll see that it always says that it's due at 11 o'clock, 11 p.m., 11 p.m., 11 p.m. I don't know what you're seeing that says something different, but just ignore it because it's there and you guys could go in and do these up until 11 p.m. on those 2 dates. Okay? Any questions about the lay of the land between now and the end of the semester? About how we're going to get through this? All right, cool. One final plug. One last time, just in case you're curious, for SI, here are the results from test 3. So the overall numbers are down the bottom for the 2 sections combined. It's about a half letter grade. You guys in your section are seeing less of an effect than we're seeing in the 8 o'clock section. And I think the reason why is the last 2 tests you guys have done as well as any section I've ever had has done. So there gets to be a point, especially if a significant number of the SI attendees are people who are getting B pluses and A minuses and A's, there's not much more room for you to improve, right? That's what's called a ceiling effect. That may explain why you guys are seeing about a 3% kick, whereas they're seeing a 7.5% kick. No matter what, that overall average increase is from a C to a C plus, and that's again, you know, half a letter grade. We're talking 5%. Which is a significant bump to the grades. The great number also is that we are now at 40% of you guys having attended at least one session, which is phenomenal because last semester it wasn't until the very end that we approached 40%. So if you haven't gone, I'd recommend going. They're going to have lots of good practice that you guys can work on together for the section on the psych disorders treatment and social psych. All right? So, cool. Let's jump over into a quick little rundown of what we did on Thursday online. I'm not going to redo all this. I am going to redo that clicker question in a minute because it's related to this discussion. So the first big idea that you need to get your heads around is the idea that there are 3 Ds that we can use to distinguish between normal and abnormal behavior. If you want to draw the line somewhere, you should look at, is the behavior deviant? Does it stand out in some way? And here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to use the video that we're going to see in about 15 minutes as a way to think about this. So you're going to see Stephanie, this young mom who has pretty severe obsessive compulsive disorder. She's deviant because she does some things that you probably have never seen anyone ever do before. Okay? It stands out as an outlier. There is clearly distress and suffering. Stephanie tears up several times discussing what's going on with her and these problems with OCD. And then in terms of dysfunction, this is the most important one because, as I mentioned on Thursday, it's a requirement for the diagnosis for every disorder. It says the above listed symptoms cause a clinically significant level of impairment in functioning. In English, that means it makes your grades tank if you're a student. If it's about your job, you start doing a worse job at work. If it's about relationships, relationships fall apart. Relate it to what's going on with whatever the disorder might be. Okay, so those 3Ds are a really useful framework for trying to define where the line is between normal and abnormal. In fact, having done that, let's do this clicker question right off the bat. So which of these folks is having problems to the degree that the problems are causing an impairment in functioning? So again, we're on channel AA, just in case you haven't noticed that all semester long. So is it Joe, Karen, Larry, or Mike who's got impairment in functioning? So again, the issue is about who's showing evidence that they're not doing well in areas of their lives that they otherwise might be doing better in. And for those of you who were there live or view the recording, we did this during the online session as well. Alrighty. Oh, we're good there? So why is it Mike? Well, the deal with Mike is he's got problems in relationships, so his wife has left him. He's got occupational consequences. He's lost his job, and generally speaking, his life has fallen apart because he's at the point where he has ended up homeless. All right, good. We use this slide to talk about the medical model that's embodied in the DSM-5. We said it's put together by the Psychiatric Association, which means it's medical doctors. So they're thinking about things like depression or OCD or ADHD or whatever in the same way that they think about medical disorders, medical diseases. So they talk about etiology, diagnosis, treatment, and prognosis. Etiology is what causes the disorder. The diagnosis should indicate what you should do about treatment. Probably the most important idea on this slide was this distinction to be made between categorical and dimensional. Right? And we said the categorical approach embodied in DSM-5 says these things are black or white. You have the disorder or you don't. Okay? It's an all or none phenomenon. Whereas the dimensional approach says, well, things like depression reside along a continuum. And people have those depressive symptoms to different degrees. And maybe there's a line where, you know, if you score above 70 or 80 on a 100-point scale, maybe you're a person that should be referred for treatment. But that dimensional approach says these phenomena are continuous, whereas the categorical approach says this stuff is dichotomous, right? You have it or you don't. You're pregnant or you're not. Your arm's broken or it's not. There's no middle ground with respect to these things when you take a categorical approach. Okay? And we'll come back to that when we look at the symptoms of depression this morning. They've got the full checklist, and you'll see, you know, the trade-offs in regards to taking that more categorical approach to diagnosis versus a dimensional one. This is a hugely important slide because it was the one where I again piggybacked in the theme of nature versus nurture. So let me make this full screen and scribble in a couple things for you guys here. Number one, we said the left side of the slide is where we see nature, that is biology and genes, those sorts of things, potentially driving you towards something like depression. Okay? The way I like to think about the nature part of the story here, these diatheses or vulnerabilities are what we often refer to as distal causes. Distal means, well, often the distance kind of lurking in the background. On the right side here is where we've got nurture, and this is where I would say we have what we call more proximate causes. I'm going to try to squeeze this in here. Proximate. Okay, these are the more immediate causes. So a proximate cause is kind of the final straw. It's the trigger that leads to the development of depression. So this model says it's not one or the other, but it's both of these factors, where maybe you have a vulnerability to depression because of a neurotransmitter imbalance. Your serotonin levels are lower than we would want them to be, for example, as we'll talk about today. And then what happens is some of these negative life events are the more immediate or proximate causes. Okay? They trigger the development of the psych disorder, but that wouldn't happen if you didn't have these distal causes lurking in the background. And the analogy I used on Thursday was the way to think about the diatheses or the predispositions over here is that they are things that, if we use the analogy of falling off a cliff as the development of a psych disorder, these diatheses or predispositions move you closer to the edge of the cliff. Okay? And if you are closer to the edge of the cliff, you don't need as much of a push from these nurture life stressors that trigger the depression, right? You might only take one or two things to knock you over the edge of the cliff if you're close to the edge because of these diatheses. If instead you don't have those diatheses, the cliff is still over there, you're farther away from it, it probably is going to take more of these environmental triggers to push you over that edge. Okay, if that analogy works for you to help you think about these factors, that's fine. All right? Questions on that at all? Going to ask you something for sure about that. Yeah. Yeah, good question. Does there have to be something here? I guess is your question, can you get to a disorder just because of these things here? Yeah, generally speaking, this model says no, you need both, right? That this thing might put you really, really close to the edge, but there's got to be something that kind of just flicks you right over the edge, even if it's not something really significant. It could be relatively minor in reality, but that's the thing that pushes you over. I guess the way I'd say it is we don't have any disorders where, for example, with the genes, that the genes dictate that you're definitely going to get the disorder. So there's definitely evidence of biological vulnerabilities for sure, but there's nothing that says it's guaranteed. So I would say, yeah, there's always something here that ultimately pushes you over the edge, whatever that is. Okay? Good. Any other questions on that? It's a little review thing here. And we talked about this one. I think the key take home here that I want to remind you guys about is comorbidity, right? That was 2+. It was how I shortened that for you. We've got 2 or more disorders occurring in the same person at the same time. The reason that's so important is that it's the rule rather than the exception. There are more people who have 2 or more disorders than there are people who have only one disorder. Okay? So more often than not, if somebody has something like major depression, there's going to be something else going on. Okay? And there are certain clusters of disorders that tend to co-occur. So if somebody has depression, I'd say you want to ask some questions about substance use and anxiety, because those 3 go together a fair amount. Okay? If you have someone, for example, like Stephanie with OCD, it's really common for OCD to co-occur with depression. Okay? Because as you'll see in the video, it's pretty overwhelming to have these kinds of problems related to OCD, and you could see how it would make a person feel sad and overwhelmed and so forth. So those things, again, tend to co-occur. I forgot to mention when I did this slide on Thursday, and I'll remind you guys when we get to the slide today on depression about it as well, that when we go through these different disorders and we start talking about these kinds of anxiety disorders, I need to give you guys the warning about something called medical student syndrome. You guys ever heard of that? Who's ever heard of medical student syndrome and can explain it to me? Not you. It's because she's one of my SI leaders, not because I don't like her. Okay? So medical student syndrome, what do you think that means? I'm going to come back to you, Ann, if nobody else volunteers. When you're in medical school and you learn about, tell me, what is it about?
So basically when you learn about the disorders, you think you have it.
So you learn about some obscure medical disease in medical school, you're like, oh God, I've got that. Okay? So when we do these disorder studies, these anxiety disorders, like, I've got 4 anxiety disorders. And then he did that godforsaken 9-symptom checklist for depression, and I had 8 of those 9. And you walk out of here and you think you have everything. Okay? So don't do that. Don't let that happen. And even worse, don't start diagnosing people over lunch today. Because you're like, oh, I saw a slide about depression today, so now I can diagnose it. Okay? It's a little more complicated than that. So here's what we did on Thursday, guys. We got through the first 3. And in terms of a brief review, we said GAD was this generalized anxiety disorder where the key word, I think, is non-specific. It's not triggered by any one thing. It's about lots of different things that might come to mind driving the anxiety. We contrasted that with phobias, which we said were these intense, irrational fears of specific objects or situations. So it's spiders, or it's heights, or it's closed spaces, or it's blood, or whatever it is. With a phobia, it's specific. And then panic disorder was the disorder that we said had as its core feature panic attacks. And the real concern with panic disorder is about having another panic attack. So really the anxiety with panic disorder is about your physiological reactivity. What you're worried about is having the heart rate, breathing, feeling like I'm having a heart attack thing happen again. It's not about spiders or ants or whatever you're afraid of here. It's not GAD. It's about the physiology. What I also mentioned at the end with panic disorder was that the panic attack symptom can actually occur across any of these disorders. So panic attack is a symptom that can occur anywhere through these anxiety disorders, but it's at the core of panic disorder, again, because the concern is I might have another panic attack, and that's what I'm really afraid of. Okay? Any questions about those 3 and being able to distinguish between and among them? Okay, what we're going to do is talk about the bottom 2. We'll take a look at a video of OCD. We'll do a clicker question to wrap up the section on anxiety disorders, and then we'll move on to mood. So with obsessive compulsive disorder, the first thing that I want you guys to understand is what is the difference between an obsession and a compulsion. An obsession is what I'm going to call for you guys an intrusive thought. An intrusive thought. What do you think intrusive means in this context? An intrusive thought is one that comes to mind and is really hard to shake. Okay? So it sort of gets stuck in your mind and you can't get away from it and you can't stop thinking about it. And the key thing is these intrusive thoughts, these obsessions in OCD are what drive anxiety through the roof. Okay? This is why I'm still talking about OCD on this anxiety disorder slide. In DSM-5, they've slid it out and put it in a category that says compulsive disorders. Still at its core, it's about anxiety. So for intro, I want to keep it right here. They can help you slice and dice it differently in abnormal. But for our purposes, the key thing is it's about anxiety. This thing right here is what makes OCD so problematic. You're going to see it with Stephanie. Okay? So I could have an intrusive thought that what I obsess about is germs. Okay, so if I come into a classroom like this and I have an obsession with germs, there has been nonstop coughing and sneezing since I started talking. Okay, so there are plenty of germs being tossed around in here. Okay, if you think about the gross things that are underneath the little table that you're leaning on as you're taking your notes, there's more germs there. There's germs on the seats that you're sitting on. All of this stuff. Now we get going with the obsession with the germs, these intrusive thoughts. And it might ultimately yield a desire to engage in a compulsion. Okay? So the compulsion is a repetitive, ritualistic behavior. Repetitive, ritualistic behavior. Repetitive means you do it again and again. What does ritualistic mean? There's a certain way you do it, right? And that's the right way to do it. And you have to do it that way. You're going to see Stephanie with her hand washing ritual. It's mind-boggling. Okay? She's going to have the hot water running the entire time that she is washing every single finger on each hand 3 times. And she does this 22 times in 30 minutes. That's repetitive, that's ritualistic behavior. Why does she wash her hands so much? Because it has an impact on her anxiety. What do these compulsions do for your anxiety? Your anxiety is here, and after you wash your hands, what happens? Whew, so much better, right? So these compulsive behaviors are maintained because what they do for you is they reduce the anxiety that is originally produced by the obsessions. Okay, so that's a lot of words. Think about it for a second, right? Basically what goes on here is when you are obsessed with germs, maybe you're obsessed with symmetry like monk, right? Maybe you're obsessed with some other sort of part of your life. You're obsessed with safety, right? So you constantly think about that. And what you need to do to relieve the anxieties produced by thinking about that is engaging in your compulsive behavior. So these obsessions and compulsions are directly related to each other, right? The compulsion is done to relieve the anxiety. So think about that for a second. If anxiety is here, and I do my hand washing ritual, and now it's here, what form of operant conditioning is that? When something is bothering me, and I do the behavior and I get rid of the thing that's bothering me. Negative reinforcement. Write it down, and if you get stuck on any test question that asks about this, the answer is always going to be negative reinforcement. It's going to come up again when we talk about substance use. Do you know why people go out and get hammered? Because the things that they're worried about, they stop worrying about them when they get hammered. Right? That's what happens. Now, what happens is then you sober up and the problems are still there, and sometimes there are more at it now as a function of the drinking or the drug use. But that would be another scenario where what we've got is that negative reinforcement happening. Okay? It's also relevant to phobias, and we'll talk more about that when we have the slide on etiology. Questions about the difference between obsessions and compulsions. So obsessions are the thoughts that come to mind you can't shake. They make you get really anxious. The compulsion is the behavior that you do to get rid of the anxiety. Let's watch Stephanie in action. And notice again with her how it's a really, really nice example of our 3Ds here. You're going to see all three of these: deviant, distress, and dysfunction in this video for sure. So let's find it. We're going to go here. This is just in the chapter 13 in the anxiety disorder section. So I click on this guy, and anxiety disorders is 13.3. Where the hell is it? No, it's here. I'm sorry. It's under the OCD section 13.4. OCD, a young mother's struggle. It's about 6 minutes or so here. Let's check this out. A little catchy tune to make sure you're paying attention.
Her obsessions centre around her baby son, Jake.
When I come to stop signs, I have to look at him while I'm stationary, for fear that someone's going to come up and take him, open the door. I have to start the car before I take my eyes off him. When I'm moving, I figure nobody can get to him.
Stephanie's protective maternal instincts have gone into overdrive. It's a form of OCD that sometimes afflicts new mothers.
Don't like it. Don't like it. Doesn't like.
Watch this one.
To set the strap, I'm going to use a video cassette, which I shall lean against the door. Then I'm going to take this pen and line it up along the green rectangle. And I'm going to point this napkin so the edge, if you follow it with your eye, matches up with the corner of my wall.
Stephanie fears that someone might kidnap Jake, even when she's at home with the doors locked and the alarm on.
I'm not sure somebody might have gotten in the house while I wasn't here, so I'll set a trap. I will set things up at a certain angle that if they're moved, I'll know it. So pathetic.
So there's deviance and distress. Because I've never seen anybody do what she just did there.
For what?
Well, I have, because I've seen
Stephanie
it.
knows her thoughts are irrational, but they're beyond her control. Protecting Jake from every conceivable danger makes life hard.
Get your stick.
When I can't take my eyes off Jake, it's literal. I stare at him. if I glance away, even like this, it's a chance for something to happen. He has to be in front of me so that I can see him the entire time, so that if somebody walks by, I know that they aren't going to bump him, spit on him, grab him, touch him,
She's worried about people
inject him
spitting
with
on her.
something, whatever, take him.
Not many people worry about that when they're taking the baby for a walk.
Like
Someone
many
might
people with
spit on
obsessive
the baby.
compulsive disorder, Stephanie also has a fear of contamination. She avoids litter or spots on the pavement in case the wheels of the buggy touch something deadly. Passers-by pose a double threat. They could kidnap Jake or contaminate him.
Just need to make sure nobody was near him. Cigarette? If I look away, I'll have to turn my stroller around, look behind me to see if anybody was in the area, but then I worry that maybe I took my eyes off him while I was checking to see if anybody was behind us. So I'll turn back around, and then I'll turn back around the other way, and I'll just spin around in circles until I feel relatively
Jake
sure
up with a really
that it's
strong
okay.
That's what's going to happen. All the twisting around is going to be really strong in the neck.
Sometimes it's hard for me to go for a walk because I can never get home, because I'm constantly having to turn around and go the other way because there's somebody coming. If somebody's walking towards me, then I get frantic.
No, that's... Please keep him on a leash.
And it's a fear of never knowing if he was contaminated. So I'll never know if the person who walked by touched him. And that will eat away at me.
So there's the obsession, right? That's the intrusive thought.
Before Jake was born, Stephanie was diagnosed as having OCD. Her obsessional fear of contamination leads to compulsive rituals which she uses to manage her anxiety.
When I am going to interact with Jake in some way, I have to be certain my hands have been just cleaned. And they have to be scoured clean.
The irony is that little kids stick
The
anything
urge
in
to
their mouth,
perform
right?
these compulsions is so strong that in this half hour Stephanie washed her hands 22 times.
22 times in 30 minutes.
It's torturous. I wash my hands continuously.
So there's the distress
I
again.
know,
She's
I
tearing.
try to stop myself, but it's almost like my feet begin moving for the sink, and I'm trying to tell myself not to do it, but I'm desperate and I have to.
And the washing ritual is complex and has to be performed absolutely correctly 3 times.
I have to lather up my hands completely, drawing my fingers through my other hand. The water has to be as hot as it can be. I start with my forefinger and scrape under my left thumb, and then I switch to my thumbnail and go to my forefinger, the middle finger, ring finger, and then I get to the pinky and I switch to this hand and go back and forth several times, and that just gets the first layer of contamination off, because I still feel, since I scraped under my nails, that it's somewhere on me. So I have to get another pump and do it all over again. And this is really the one that I feel cleans me, because now my nails are clean, and now
How hot's that water
going
going
to
to
scrub my hands. And then I have to do a finishing rinse. This is the part that's hard because the water's really hot, burning, but sometimes I keep my hands under there just to feel better. And then I get my towel.
Watch this. You gotta get it in the trash bucket.
Be careful not to touch the garbage when I put this in, so I have to...
So what happens when the trash bucket pop-up lid hits her hand? What's she got to do? She got to start over, right? So I'm not showing this video to make fun of her, but it certainly demonstrates for us a lot of what we've been talking about in terms of distress, deviance, and dysfunction. Questions about what you saw in there and how it maps on to our discussion about obsessions and compulsions. Does it make sense? So really good, memorable examples. And the nice thing about this little video is there's a complimentary video in the treatment lecture that shows you the treatment for OCD. and actually shows you Stephanie again getting that treatment. So there'll be more on that in that recording for you guys. All right, the final disorder that I want to mention with you guys is post-traumatic stress disorder. You almost certainly have heard about it, called PTSD. It is a unique disorder in the diagnostic system because it's the only DSM disorder that requires something to have happened to you. And what has to have happened to you is some sort of a traumatic stressor. What's a traumatic stressor? It's things like combat experience in a war. It's a physical assault. It's a sexual assault. It's being kidnapped. It's witnessing someone being murdered. It's being in a horrific car accident. It's having your house burned down. All of these things. So thinking back to this stress chapter, it's those really severe, right, high intensity, high severity stressors. Okay, and then in the aftermath of any of those various traumatic stressors, you get 3 different clusters of symptoms that I want you guys to know something about. Number 1, you will get re-experiencing of the event. Okay? You feel like it's happening again. And that could be triggered during your waking hours. So if you have combat experience, let's say in Iraq or Afghanistan, and you're at a Padres game, and they have some special event where they fly a big helicopter over the top of Petco, that could make you re-experience what happened to you in that war, and you're diving under your seat. Okay? The re-experiencing could be in the form of dreams or nightmares during your sleeping hours. Okay? That's the first cluster. The second cluster involves some form of numbing or withdrawal. So this is sort of 2 things in one, really, numbing or withdrawal. The numbing is the fact that the person who experiences this traumatic stressor might talk about it in a very sort of just the facts way. Okay? So they sort of relate, like, here's what happened, and then this, and then that. And there's no emotion. It's numb because the emotion has been sort of sucked out of it. The withdrawal can be physical or emotional withdrawal around loved ones, family members not wanting to be around other people, maybe not wanting to talk about whatever that event might have been. Okay, so that numbing or withdrawal can be part of that. And then the third symptom cluster is what's known as hyperarousal. Hyper, means an excessive amount of something, and in this case, it's hyperarousal, where you're overly vigilant. What you get is this hypervigilance, where the person can see the hyperarousal manifested in irritability. If you're hyperarousal and worried and watchful all the time, you might have problems sleeping. So insomnia would be related to the hyperarousal. You could see problems with increasing aggressiveness. In the context of an academic setting, hyperarousal might manifest itself with problems concentrating. Okay? The final way you might see hyperarousal is in what's called an increased startle response. So a startle response is that kind of jumpy thing you do, right? If like a car backfires as you're walking down the street and you do this, that's your startle response. What we see with folks with PTSD is it doesn't take a super loud noise to make them do that kind of jumpy startle response. Okay? So those are 3 clusters of symptoms that you can see in the context of PTSD. Okay? Any questions about that at all? If you're curious about what causes these things, that's what we're going to get to in just a second. This is a nice table in your textbook that pulls in a lot of what we have talked about. It's got a couple things in here that we didn't talk about a whole lot. We mentioned agoraphobia. We didn't really mention separation anxiety disorder. You guys can read about those, but there's plenty of ground for us to cover with the big 5 anxiety disorders that we did talk about. So let me jump down and grab the slide with another clicker question that we actually did as well online on Thursday. And let you guys take a shot at this one about this 3rd grade teacher who's got dizziness, heart palpitations, muscle tension, fatigue. She's agitated. She can't relax outside the classroom, but she can't pinpoint a reason for these problems. Does that sound like PTSD, a phobia, OCD, or GAD? Again, lots of acronyms in this section on the anxiety disorders. Alrighty. This looks really good, so I'm not going to belabor this. Generalized anxiety disorder, what's the key phrase for you guys there? Can't pinpoint a reason, right? That's the big thing. That's a clue as to what's going on with her. So let's talk about the etiology of anxiety disorders. Got a couple different clusters of causal factors here. So remember, etiology is about what causes the disorder. So biologically, we know from twin studies that there is a genetic predisposition that you can inherit here genetically. So I'm going to sneak in the word diathesis to piggyback this on the diathesis stress slide that we talked about before. So you could be vulnerable to or susceptible to something like OCD because it runs in your family. Okay? How do we know this? Well, we know this from twin studies. And what we do is we compare a number between MZ twins and DZ twins. And when we find a bigger number for the MZ twins versus the DZ twins, it's indicative of a genetic contribution, or this genetic predisposition idea. The number that we compute is something you don't need to know any specifics about for the test. It's called a concordance rate. And you're going to learn more about these if you take abnormal. But here's the deal. Here's what a concordance rate is. A concordance rate is simply a percentage that tells me what percentage of the time does the second twin have, let's say, OCD, if we know already that the first twin has it. Does that make sense? So if we know that twin 1 has it, what percentage of the time does twin 2 end up with that disorder? Here's the deal. I'll give you an example of this in action. It's not for these anxiety disorders, but it really drives home the point about heritability here. Okay? For schizophrenia, which we're going to talk about on Thursday, the prevalence rate in the overall population, I actually mentioned on Thursday, is 1%. Okay? Now think about the logic here and what's going on with the genes. A random person has a 1 in 100 chance of developing schizophrenia. Let's pretend that you are the fraternal twin and your fraternal twin has schizophrenia. Your risk rate is not 1%, it's about 17%. So you go from a 1 in 100 chance to a 1 in 6 chance. Okay? Now if you think that's bad, let's think now that you're the identical twin of someone who has schizophrenia. The risk is not 1%, it's not 17%, it's about 48%. So you go from 1 in 100 to a 1 in 2 chance. About half the time you end up with schizophrenia if you share all the genes with someone who has that disorder. So do you see the logic, right? If you become more and more similar genetically to someone who's got X, your risk of developing X goes up and up and up. Does that make sense? Okay? So I guess the take-home message is when you order the twin without the schizophrenia, because you don't want to go from 1 in 100 to 1 in 2. That's not one that you want to have. Other biological accounts for these anxiety disorders. There is an anxiety sensitivity or feedback loop model specific for panic disorder, and here's the deal. The model is this. With panic disorder, we said it's about physiological symptoms, right? That's what you're worried about. What happens with folks with panic disorder is that their threshold for tolerating physiological symptoms, that's what SXS stands for, by the way, their tolerance level is much lower than it is for somebody who doesn't have panic disorder. What do I mean by their tolerance level? They get more upset by less physiological arousal than do people who don't have panic disorder. And what happens is when their heart races and their breathing becomes more rapid and so forth, in reaction to those physiological symptoms, what they tend to engage in is what we call catastrophic thinking. Catastrophic thinking. What does that mean? Well, let me give you the example. Okay, the example I always use is, let's pretend we get done at 10:45 and you almost have to literally run to Adams Humanities to get to your next class where you have a quiz starting right at 11 o'clock. Okay, you get to the classroom there and you sit down and it's hot out and you're kind of sweaty and you're breathing kind of rapidly and you notice that your heart is racing. And if you don't have panic disorder, that doesn't upset you because your threshold for tolerating that stuff is here. If you're prone to this anxiety sensitivity in panic disorder, you have a much lower threshold. And what happens now is you start thinking to yourself, This is not good. This heart rate and the breathing and being the sweaty, this is not good. When you have those thoughts, what happens to your heart rate? It probably starts to go up. If your heart rate goes up, what might you start saying to yourself over here in terms of your thinking? This could be really, really bad. Then what happens? That feeds into your heart rate, and you're like, oh my God, I think I'm having a heart attack. Oh my God, I'm going to die. Around and around and around, just because you ran like a little bit across campus. Okay? So do you see the idea? It's this threshold. Is like you're way overreacting to what is physiologically what is supposed to happen when you exert yourself. And so what happens is it triggers these kinds of problems. All right? Does that make sense for panic disorder? The cool thing is, and I don't really talk about this in the treatment lecture, is there's a really effective behavioral treatment for panic disorder, which involves actually inducing the physiological symptoms. So if it's heart rate, we get your heart rate up. If it's dizziness, we get you dizzy. And then realizing that heart rate going up or dizziness doesn't mean you're going to die. Okay? Now, if it is a heart rate thing, before we induce those heart rate physiological symptoms, we make sure you've had a good physical and make sure you really don't have a heart condition. Because if you do have a heart condition and then we run you up and down the stairs and you have a heart attack, that's not good. That's really, like if you die, that's a bad treatment outcome. Okay? So we get you medically cleared, say, you actually don't have a heart condition. What you've got is this panic disorder thing, and we'll do this treatment, and it works really, really well. It's not particularly fun to do for the person with panic disorder, but it does work real well. All right, let me get rid of all my scribbling. The other biological factor I want to mention here is the neurotransmitters. We can focus in on GABA. GABA levels are too low in the context of anxiety disorders. If you don't recall, I'll remind you, in the bio section we mentioned GABA as an inhibitory neurotransmitter. So that just means GABA slows things down. And the analogy I used was GABA was like pressing on the brakes of the car. Okay? So when you press on the brakes of the car, you slow things down. If you're all shook up, what I'll do to increase your GABA levels is I'll give you something like a Valium or a Xanax. Okay? Those are two what are called benzodiazepine medications that will increase those GABA levels. Okay? So when I increase GABA levels, I slow things down. Okay? The two drawbacks to those medications, by the way, are number one, they can be habit forming, and number two, they have really heavily sedating effects. And people who are anxious, they just want to be less anxious. They don't want to be sedated, right? Like when you have allergies like we do right now because of this awful dry weather, you take a Benadryl, well, yeah, I don't have the allergies, but I have to sleep all day. Right? That's not what you really want. In a similar way, the folks here with the anxiety disorders don't want to be sedated. Okay? Any questions on those biological counts, biological factors contributing here? Make sense? Okay. Learning and conditioning. This is a huge section. I guarantee I'm going to ask questions around these factors because we've talked about these a lot previously, and now we're going to tie it into the section on what causes the anxiety disorders. You know already, right? You can learn to be afraid of things through classical conditioning. We saw it with little Albert. We saw it with you guys with the dentist drill sound effect, right? That's not anything new. But you should certainly know about things that were previously neutral stimuli now becoming CSs for you and making you have responses related to anxiety that you didn't used to have to those stimuli. Second key point is you can maintain your fears through operant conditioning. Tell me what you typically do with respect to your phobic stimuli. The things that you're really afraid of, where you have an intense irrational fear, what will you do at all costs related to those things? If you're really, really afraid of being on an elevator, what do? Avoid it, right? I hear a bunch of people saying avoid. That's the key word here. So especially when we're talking about these phobias, you will avoid whatever you're afraid of. You're afraid of going to the dentist? Call and cancel the appointment. Whew, I feel so much better now that I don't have to go to that appointment. Okay? I was afraid I was going to have to take the elevator. Thank God I could take stairs up 12 floors. Okay, feel a lot better. Okay, maybe I'm probably also in better shape from doing that, right? But what we've got going on here is avoidance, and every time you avoid that anxiety-provoking situation, what happens to your anxiety level? It goes down. What is that again in terms of operant conditioning? Negative reinforcement again. Put it in your notes. Again, when in doubt, guess negative reinforcement. Do you understand how that's negative reinforcement? Right? Really, really anxious? I just won't take that class where you have to do presentations. I'll take this other class where I never have to do any kind of presentation. My anxiety level is reduced significantly. Okay? By the way, in terms of treatment, you're going to see this in the treatment video. What do you think we do for the things that you're afraid of? Do we let you keep avoiding them? What do you think treatment involves? You got to face the stuff that you're afraid of. Okay? And it could be either in a graduated way, so you'll learn about systematic desensitization where we do kind of baby steps until maybe we're ultimately getting you on the elevator. You'll also hear a little bit in that video about the alternative approach is not baby steps. It's throw you in the deep end of the pool. It's called flooding. And so what we do in the first treatment session is we take the elevator to the 100th floor together. Okay? That sounds a little more devious. It's as effective, but it's generally not as preferred by the person who's got the phobia. And then finally, observational learning. Don't lose sight of this. In the video, kind of cut off weird at the end there with the Stephanie video. I don't know why they re-sliced that. But at the end of the original version of that video, she expresses some concerns for Jake about becoming anxious, maybe having like OCD type symptoms because he mimics her. And what he does is he goes over to the pump, the soap pump, and what does he do? He's pumping on it and he does this because he's seen her do that, right? If you've learned to be afraid of something, maybe you've got some phobias because you remember your mom jumping up on the kitchen table when she saw a spider. You're like, I should be afraid of that too, I guess, right? So we can learn these things via observational learning as well. Final point here, before we start talking about the mood disorders, is that there are certain ways of thinking that might make you more vulnerable to anxiety disorders. And probably the number one way of thinking, I think, that makes the most sense here is when you do what I would call lots of scanning for threats. Okay? When your thinking is all about looking around you and considering what might go wrong. Okay? That's a way of thinking that might make you more prone to anxiety, right? Imagine that I gave you a youngster and I said, what I want you to do in your parenting is make sure this child ends up with an anxiety disorder. Okay? That's a devious, weird thing to do. But just play along with me, because we're talking about what causes it. Well, one thing you could do is with that child, to get them thinking in these ways, is throughout their day, point out all the dangerous things around them in their world. So when you take them to the playground, what should you point out about this slide? What could happen? You could fall back down the steps of the slide. You could slide off so fast that you crack the back of your head on the ground. But now it's all covered in sticks or whatever, right? Chopped up rubber. There are lots of things that could go wrong, right? When you're sitting in this classroom, if you're prone to these ways of thinking, you might sit there and look up and say, oh, you know what? This panel could fall right on my head. Okay, it could fall right on his head. Is that possible? Yes. Is it likely? No. See, and here's what happens. Folks who are prone to anxiety, they way overestimate like the likelihood of that happening. Right? You're like, oh my God, I could die today because a panel could fall on my head. Now, I've been in this classroom for like 11 or 12 years. No one has died yet. I'm hoping it doesn't happen right now. Okay? So what you do is you overestimate the risks of things. This way of thinking makes you prone to that stuff. Do you guys see that? Okay? So if you're scanning your environment, constantly looking for what might go wrong, that's what's going to make you prone to anxiety, right? When you walk across campus after class, one of these physical plant trucks, the pickup trucks, could run you over because they only drive around when there's thousands of people moving from class to class, right? It's the only time they drive. You go out there right now, they're not there, right? And now they drive on that one side where the godforsaken bike lane is, and you're done. You're going to get run over. Somebody's going to get run over. But I've been here for 16 years. Still no one has gotten run over by the physical plant truck yet, right? But if you think in those ways, that's going to cause you problems with the anxiety disorders. All right. Any questions on any of these factors? Make sense? Cool. Let's talk about mood. Two big mood disorders you need to know something about are unipolar depression or major depressive disorder, sometimes referred to as MDD. I'll just call it depression because it's the shortest name. And the other one is called bipolar disorder. First thing I want you to notice is the huge prevalence rates of depression, right? Schizophrenia, we said, was 1%. Prevalence rates for some of those anxiety disorders was like 2 or 3%. Oh my goodness, for women, major depression rates go up in the 20-some% range, okay? This is why depression is referred to as the common cold of the mental disorders. So you got to learn something about depression because it's probably the most likely thing you're going to encounter if you end up working as a psychologist, psychiatrist, social worker, or whatever, okay? We could have a half-hour discussion or longer about why we have these gender differences between men and women. I'm not going to get into that in great detail. You talk about that for sure in abnormal. I want to contrast major depression, which is going to be our major focus, with this other form of a mood disorder called bipolar disorder. And here's the way I like to do this. I like to draw a line across the slide here and say, okay, let's consider this line here to be a normal mood state. Okay, whatever the heck that is, that's going to be normal. Okay? What happens with depression is you get these periods of time, for weeks or maybe a couple months, where your mood is below where we would otherwise expect it to be if it was like a normal mood state. Okay, and I'm going to fill in the blanks on the specific symptom checklist for depression. Okay, that's unipolar depression or major depressive disorder, MDD, where all you have, and I'm not trying to minimize it by saying all you have, is depression. The contrast then is between that and a scenario where the depressive episodes are then followed by, on occasion, episodes of an elevated mood state. And this elevated mood state is what we refer to as mania, or we say the person is having a manic episode. Okay? You'll notice that the width of that manic episode is smaller. This is sort of meant to represent a timeline. So generally speaking, in bipolar disorder, the length of time that the manic symptoms last is much, much smaller than the length of time that the depressive symptoms last. Okay? So depression will be weeks or months, could be years, hopefully not. The mania is going to be like on the order of days. Okay, why? Because, well, here's what goes on during a manic episode. Okay, during a manic episode, you will have the person showing a decreased need for sleep. So they might be awake for 2 or 3 or 4 days in a row. Okay, during a manic episode, they might have feelings of invincibility. They might sit down at lunch and say, during this manic episode, you know, I think I've got a really good idea that will put Google out of business by the end of the week. Okay, cool. They might evidence what we call pressured speech, which is really, really rapid speech. I know I talk quickly sometimes, but pressured speech is like, you know, the guy at the end of the car commercial when he goes 0.9% APR, blah, blah, blah. So fast, you can't understand. That's pressured speech. So they'll do that. They'll be uninhibited in various ways during a manic episode. So they'll say outrageous things. They'll go on shopping sprees. Okay, so a person in a manic episode will go on shopping sprees. I still vividly remember the first patient I ever sat in on an intake at the VA back in when you guys were like 0, was a guy who's coming off a manic episode, and he had bought 80 pairs of sneakers over the weekend on the shopping spree. I'm like, dude, you have 2 feet, right? And even if they're $40 a piece, that's $3,200, right? So shopping sprees, gambling, you get sexual acting out. I'll try to keep this clean. You sort of lower your standards. I won't say more than that, but you get the idea. So it's basic. I mean, what it feels like is if you just unplug the frontal lobe and just go, right? If the frontal lobe just is the brakes, is I shouldn't do that or I shouldn't do that other thing. During a manic episode, it kind of feels that way. Okay? So again, the take-home message is with bipolar disorder, right? The bi part means 2. You get both the downs of depression and then the ups of mania as well. Okay? And you could have, with bipolar disorder, periods of time where you're right around that quote, normal, that yellow line there. It's not always depression or mania. It could be, sort of flatlining a little bit, but we get these alternating periods like that. Does that make sense? Any question about the distinction there between those two? Say again? Yeah. Yeah, so with major depressive disorder, it's just the down red area of depression. And if the question is, could you just have mania without the depression go along with it, that's super rare. And one of the key take-home messages about this is going to be, the treatments are going to be really different too, right? Because the treatments that we use for depression are about lifting you out of depression. But if you have bipolar disorder, I don't want to push you too far up out of depression. Why? Because that could fling you into mania, right? And that's not something we want to have happen. All right, so remember what I said before about medical student syndrome, because here's our symptom checklist for depression. I'm going to give you all 9. You don't need to write them down. You don't need to memorize them. I just want you to see this as an embodiment of that categorical model we talked about on Thursday. So the first 2 symptoms here are depressed mood most of the day, nearly every day. Well, duh, it's called depression, right? So this is usually for a period of 2 weeks or more. Depressed mood most of the day, nearly every day. It turns out if you take Psych 333, which is childhood disorders class, you'll learn that you can actually substitute in for kids and adolescents not a depressed mood, but an irritable mood. Okay? So the depression in a teenager might manifest itself in irritability. Now you might think about that for a second. Say, an irritable teenager. That's redundant, isn't it? Right? That's all of them are like that. That's where your clinical experience has to come in and be able to distinguish between what is the irritability of teenage years and what is major depression. So depressed mood, and then diminished interest in or pleasure in activities. Less interest in your activities, but you still do them, but you don't enjoy them as much. Or you stop doing them, right? Diminished interest in or pleasure in activities means you're not doing the things you used to do for fun. Here's the rule, guys. You have to have, ultimately, on this list, 5 out of 9, and one of them must be either number 1 or number 2. So if I start interviewing you right now for a diagnostic intake interview, and you say, no, I don't really have depressed mood, no, I don't really have a change in interest in my activities, I'm not asking you any more questions about depression. Why? Because you're not going to get diagnosed with it. Even if you had all the remaining 7, the hard and fast rule to get the check mark in the yes box for depression is you've got to have one of these first 2. What are the other ones? Changes in appetite, which result in changes in weight. You eat more and gain weight. You eat less and lose weight. Okay? So there's changes in that regard. There are changes in your sleep. Insomnia is sleeplessness. Hypersomnia is excessive sleep, sleeping like 18 or 20 hours a day. How many people feel like that's a symptom they want to have? I want some of that. Right about now, right? So, but if you had that for 5, 6, 8 days in a row, that's going to be a problem, all right? Psychomotor agitation or retardation. Here is the MD psychiatrist unnecessarily complicated term of the day. Psychomotor agitation means you're restless or fidgety. You can't sit still, you're squirmy. Psychomotor retardation means the opposite. It means you're sitting still and you basically don't move, maybe during the entire interview that we're doing today. Fatigue or loss of energy, so I'm tired all the time. Feelings of worthlessness or guilt, so there's the self-esteem piece. You feel less than other people. Number 8, in an academic setting like this, problems thinking or concentrating. And then number 9, very serious suicidality, right? Suicidal thoughts, plans, or actions. All right, so remember, categorical model is black or white. You have it or you don't. To say yes, you have it, you have to have 5 out of 9 or more, and one of them's got to be either number 1 or number 2. Okay? A couple other things to mention. If the symptoms that you're experiencing, let's say you've got 5 or more out of 9, and the symptoms are directly triggered by an identifiable event, like the death of a loved one, okay, and you're really sad after one of your parents dies or grandparent or whatever, close friend, okay, we have a separate category in the DSM-5 that's called an adjustment disorder with depressed mood, where the symptoms are clearly connected to what happened there, so we put you over in this other category. Now, at some point, the clock sort of runs out on that adjustment disorder, and if the symptoms are persisting too long, you might get switched over into this diagnostic category. On some level, I don't even care which category you're in, because the treatment, whether you have depression or an adjustment disorder with depressed mood, the treatment's the same. Okay? It's going to be some cognitive and behavioral stuff that you'll hear about in the video. What else? Oh, the other rule out here. What could you do that would give you a lot of these symptoms of depression? What could you do or take or drink that would give you a lot of these symptoms? What was alcohol in the drug categories? It was a depressant. So let's imagine you're drinking 12 or 15 beers a day. And I've had guys that's what they were doing, right? 12 or 15 beers a day. How many of the 9 symptoms do you get? You might get them all. Like Yahtzee, I got them all. Look, I got all 9 symptoms. Okay? That's called a substance-induced mood disorder. It's a separate category. And in fact, for treatment, we don't do anything about mood symptoms. If you're drinking that much, we don't treat mood. Why don't we treat mood? We don't know whether there's an independent mood disorder. So the deal is this, and I had tons of guys in the alcohol and drug treatment program who would come in and say, I've not only got the problems with the alcohol, but I got the mood stuff. And I'd say, we have to table the mood consideration right now because we can't know what's going on there because you're taking a CNS depressant. So what we do is we get you clean and you're not drinking or using any other kind of drugs for 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks. Then we see what happens with the mood symptoms. Many times what happens is they go away. And so it's like a 2-for-1 deal. That's how we used to talk about it. Like if you stop drinking, you not only have all the problems related to the drinking, you know what? You're not sad anymore or any of these other things either. Okay, so you get like a 2-for-1 deal by the stopping of the drinking. Okay? Questions on the symptoms? Does that make sense? Yeah. Yeah, somebody asked the same question at 8 o'clock. Yeah. That's super rare. I mean, people don't like, I don't have anything else wrong, but I just want to kill myself, right? That's super unusual. In fact, the suicidality, in terms of even acting on it, is really specific to depression. So that would be really super unusual. If somebody came in and said that, I wouldn't care about the diagnosis. First, we're going to make sure they're safe, right? And we'll figure out this other stuff later. But that would be a really, really unusual scenario. Okay, very often they're going to have other stuff going on as well. Okay, so you can see here, right, by the way, if you're below that cut score of 5 out of 9, what if you had 3 or 4 of these pretty severely? Would you be significantly impaired? You could easily be significantly impaired, right? That's the drawback to this categorical model. It says you have to have 5 out of 9. Well, I've got 4, right? I mean, the sarcastic part of me feels like, sorry, you've only got 4 symptoms. So if you go home and just like eat a lot, we get a yes for symptom number 3. That would give you 5 and we could treat you, right? No one does that. But that sort of shows you the silliness on some level, right? When you have this categorical model that says, yes, you have it or no, you don't. Just want to point out table 13.5. It's got a couple of other depressive disorders in here. I'll just mention DMDD. This is brand new. It's not even 3 years old. This is for kids who have these really severe temper outbursts and they're grouchy and angry and acting out all the time. We've got a new category for them. Let me also mention what used to be called dysthymia. It's now called persistent depressive disorder. It's for 2 years in adults and 1 year in kids, where more days than not you have a depressed mood. You know who has dysthymia? It's Eeyore. It's a take-home example for dysthymia is Eeyore. He's just chronically sad. So the way I think about dysthymia is, if this is depression, it's deeper but shorter lasting. This is dysthymia. It's not as severe of a low, but it lasts longer. Does that make sense? That's a nice way to distinguish between those two. All right, we got to use our last 10 minutes to talk about etiology. We've got twin studies that suggest a strong genetic predisposition. So let me write the word diathesis again. Oh, and before I forget, I got to ask you guys a clicker question too. And that's particularly true for bipolar disorder. The genetic heritability for bipolar disorder is really, really strong. I saw at one point the concordance rate for MZ twins for that disorder, which runs at 1% in the population. For MZ twins, it's 70-something%. It's crazy high. Okay, so certainly that's going on here for sure in terms of genetic loading. Let me grab the clicker question I want to ask you guys so I make sure I get the points added up the way that I want them to be. This one, and this should be pretty straightforward. So after several weeks of feeling apathetic and dissatisfied, Mark has suddenly become extremely cheerful and so talkative that he can't be interrupted. He needs less sleep. He gets irritated when his friends tell him to slow down. What's going on with him? And we've got about 8 minutes to go. We're going to try to get through most of the etiological factors for the mood disorders. So clearly, I'm doing an awesome job, you guys are doing an awesome job, or these questions are too easy. Bipolar disorder, because we've got the downs, and then we've got the ups of mania. It seems like you guys have got your head around that. Awesome. Let's jump back to the etiology slide. Besides the genetic vulnerability, the other biological factor that is part of the story here is decreased levels of serotonin, which we typically try to remedy with the SSRI medications. You're going to learn more about them in the bio-treatment part of the treatment lecture. Okay? It goes into specifics of how they work. Basically, the take-home message is they will increase serotonin levels. So things like Prozac, Paxil, and Zoloft will increase levels of serotonin. Norepinephrine is also implicated. So in addition to SSRIs, which are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, we actually have SNRIs, which are selective norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors. They work in the same way, just on a slightly different neurotransmitter there. More detail than you really need to know. I want to emphasize before we wrap up today these 2 bullet points about cognitive factors in the development of things like depression. Aaron Beck says that there are distorted ways of thinking that people who are depressed tend to engage in. Number 1, they do things like what we call all or nothing thinking, where they see the world in very black or white ways of thinking. I'm trying to write nothing. So they see things in extreme forms. So they do lots of statements where they use the word always and never. Okay? Remember guys come into outpatient groups for depression and they say like, I never do anything right. I always mess up everything. That's really extreme, right? And the way clinically you try to chip away at that is, well, if you did everything wrong, you wouldn't even be here at the group today. So you did that much right, right? You'll see folks do, in these distortions, labeling of themselves. So thinking of themselves as a loser, as incompetent, okay, as just a waste of time. Okay? They'll do labeling. They'll do magnification and minimization. I'm trying to give you guys a handful of these distortions. Magnification and minimization is a really interesting one, where what they do when they're thinking, when they're really depressed, is they magnify the negative things about themselves. 72-point font for the things that aren't real good about me. But what about these other things that you're a really good musician? Let's shrink that down to 6-point font. I don't really want to focus on that. So make the bad things look really big, make the good things look really small. One final form of distortion is from the Charlie Brown comic right here. Let me show you this and we'll go back to the previous slide. It's called mind reading. Look what Chuck does here. He thinks the girls are talking about me. I wonder what they're saying about me. I was feeling so good too, now I'm all depressed. Why does someone always have to spoil my day? Did the girls do anything? Where's the problem? It's in Chuck's head. What is he assuming that they're saying over here? Something negative about him, right? He's doing that mind reading thing. Now you could argue, based on his interactions with Lucy over the years, maybe, he's got a little bit of evidence that they're not being particularly nice over there, because she's always mean to him. All right, So that's general ways of thinking. Martin Seligman, who's at Penn, says it's about attributions, which are explanations for why things happen. And Seligman says this, that for negative events, people who are prone to getting depressed tend to veer in one direction in their thinking. It's like a car that is out of alignment. When things go wrong, for negative events, Seligman says that folks who are prone to depression make three attributions. They make internal, global, and stable attributions for example, their failures. Internal, global, and stable. Okay, what does this mean? Well, let's go with someone who's likely to get depressed. They just failed their physics test. Okay? Should I blame it on myself, or should I blame it on some kind of external factor? No, I'm blaming it on myself, so what do I say? I'm totally stupid. Okay? Internal versus external. What would be an external attribution? Well, I failed the physics test because the guy was jackhammering outside the window. Or the test was unfair. Or the person sitting next to me was so attractive I couldn't even read the questions on my test. Okay? Those would be, no, it's not any of that. I'm dumb. What do you think global means? Not only do I stink at physics, but what? I stink at everything, right? That was my dramatic, everything. And stable, what do you think that means? When the next physics quiz or test rolls around, what's going to happen? I'm going to fail that too. So internal, global, and stable. Here's an example of that I built in. We'll come back to this at the beginning on Thursday. Somebody breaks up with you. One person ends up depressed, the other person doesn't. It's about how you explain why that happened. My fault, I can't do anything right, and I will never get over this. You're going to get depressed and be listening to really sad music probably. See you guys online on Thursday.